My name is Marilyn Hart. I'm 58 years old, and if you asked me what the biggest loss in a person's life really is, I wouldn't talk about money. I wouldn't even start with the empty side of the bed. I tell you about the moment you've just buried your husband, your partner, your best friend, and you come home still smelling like funeral flowers, still wearing black that feels too heavy on your shoulders, and someone stands in the middle of your living room, points at you like you're a suspect, and says in a calm, controlled voice, "Give it back. You took my father's things." The person who said that to me was Evan Hart, my late husband's son from his first marriage. I'd called Evan sweetheart a couple times out of politeness, the way you do when you're trying to keep peace. But if I'm being honest, he never looked at me like family. Not once. Not even on the day his father died. My husband Richard didn't pass quickly. He slipped away in slow pieces. It was months of appointments, medications, insurance calls, and hospital rooms that all smelled like antiseptic and waiting. I slept upright in a chair more nights than I can count. I learned the sound of the machines the way other people learn a lullaby. I held Richard's hand and told him, over and over, that he wasn't alone. Evan came exactly 3 times during the final stretch. Each visit was short, tidy, and strangely polished. Flowers, a stiff hug, a few lines about how Dad looks better today, then eyes wandering around the room, lingering on Richard's wristwatch a little too long, like he was studying it. I thought the hardest part would be living with Richard's chair empty at the kitchen table. I thought the hardest part would be learning how to say, "my husband," without breaking in half. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching my grief get turned into a courtroom and realizing I was the one on trial. After the funeral, people filled our living room. Cousins, an aunt from out of town, a couple church friends I barely knew, neighbors who meant well. The air was thick with murmured condolences and the soft clink of forks against paper plates. I barely tasted anything. I was still moving like I'd forgotten how to be in my own body. Evan stood at the center of it all, holding a small notebook like he was doing inventory at work. He spoke gently, but there was a sharpness under the gentleness, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I just want things to go where they belong," he said. "Dad had a collection. You know that. Those watches are part of the Hart family." I stared at him, trying to understand how we had gone from lowering Richard into the ground to this. Richard's watch collection wasn't just stuff. He loved those pieces the way some men love old photographs. There were nights he'd sit under our warm kitchen light and wipe fingerprints off the glass with a soft cloth, handling each watch like it held a memory. He once told me, "Meyer, every one of these reminds me of a time I got back up." I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but Evan's next sentence hit like a door slamming. "Some things are missing," he said, and then he looked straight at me. "And I think you took them." The room went quiet in that awful way it does when everyone's pretending not to hear the thing they absolutely heard. I felt my face burn. I felt my throat close. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a small, broken sound. "I took care of him," I said, and my own voice surprised me with how thin it sounded. "I was there, every day." Evan tilted his head, studying me like I was an employee who'd messed up a procedure. "Taking care of someone doesn't mean you get to own what belongs to them, Nito," he said. And then, like he was being reasonable, like he was doing the right thing, he asked if I'd mind opening up Richard's things so he could check. You learn something about language when someone has power over you. People who say, "You don't mind, do you?" usually don't care if you mind. They're not asking, they're informing you. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want another scene. I was exhausted in my bones. So I nodded, and I led him to the cabinet where Richard kept the wooden watch box. When I set it on the coffee table, my hands were shaking. Evan opened it without hesitation. He scanned the rows, the empty slots, the few pieces that still sat there neatly like they'd been waiting. He pointed to the gaps. "See?" he said. "Dad had more than this." I leaned in, confused because my memory was a blur of grief and sleepless nights. "Richard moved things sometimes," I murmured. He had a safe deposit box." Evan's eyes narrowed. "So you do know about the valuables?" My stomach dropped. I swear on everything that mattered to me, I hadn't taken anything, I hadn't sold anything. I hadn't even touched most of it after Richard got sick because it felt like touching the past too hard might make it break. But there I was, in my own living room, surrounded by people who had known Richard since childhood, and Evan was calmly painting me as the greedy second wife. That night, after everyone finally left, after I washed dishes I didn't remember using, after I locked the door and stood in the quiet for a long moment, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at Richard's chair. I wanted him back so badly it hurt to breathe. I wanted him to walk in and say, "What's all this nonsense?" The way he would have with that tired little half smile that made me feel safe. Instead, I had silence and a watchbox that suddenly felt like evidence. I told myself I needed to handle practical things. Hospital bills don't pause for grief. The funeral home doesn't hand you a discount because your heart is shattered. Richard's illness left us with invoices that came in thick official envelopes, each one heavier than the last. So the next morning, with my eyes still swollen, I made a decision that felt both reasonable and painful. I would sell a couple pieces, just enough to get through, not the collection, not the sentimental ones. Just a few items I thought wouldn't matter. I drove to a small appraisal shop run by a man named Mr. Patel. The place was neat, warm, and quiet, full of ticking and glass cases and a kind of respectful calm. It was the kind of shop where people spoke softly, like they understood that some valuables weren't just valuables. Mr. Patel put on his glasses and held the first watch under a loop. He turned it, opened the back, stared for a long time. Then he looked up at me with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't judgment. It was caution. The kind of look you give someone when you're about to say something that might make them collapse. "Mrs. Hart," he said quietly, "I'm very sorry, but this piece isn't authentic." I blinked. What? He set it down gently like it was fragile in a different way. "The movement inside is cheap," he explained. "The casing is plated. The serial markings don't match the model. It's a counterfeit." My ears rang. I felt my body go cold, like someone had poured ice water down my spine. I stared at that watch. The watch I'd watched Richard polish, the watch I'd heard tick softly in our kitchen, and my mind refused to accept what I was hearing. "That can't be," I whispered. "It was my husband's." Mr. Patel nodded slowly. "That's why I'm telling you gently, because either you were deceived or someone replaced it." Replaced it. That word latched onto my ribs and squeezed. I sat there trying to make sense of the impossible. If the watch was fake now, but it had been real before, someone had swapped it. Someone had taken the real piece and left a cheap copy behind. And if someone had done that inside my home, it wasn't a stranger. It was someone with access, someone with motive, someone who could stand over my husband's memory and call it the Hart family's. I walked out of the shop into the cold Chicago air and stood in the parking lot with my keys in my hand, shaking so hard I couldn't unlock my car. For the first time since Richard died, I cried loudly, ugly, shaking sobs because I suddenly understood something terrible. This wasn't just grief. This was a fight for my name, for my dignity, for the truth. And if I lost, I wouldn't only lose money. I'd lose the right to say I loved Richard well. I'd lose the last shred of peace he left me. Richard and I married in our 40s. I wasn't some young woman sweeping in for a fortune. I had my own work history, my own modest savings, my own scars. Richard had rough hands from years of labor, oil under his nails that never fully washed out, and a kind of steady gentleness that felt like home. Evan was already grown when I came into the picture. I never tried to replace his mother. I never demanded to be mom. I just tried to be decent. I cooked on holidays. I asked about his life. I bought small gifts and didn't get my feelings hurt when he barely reacted. As Evan got older, though, something hardened in him. He carried himself like everything was a negotiation, like every room had a hierarchy and he needed to establish his position. When Richard started getting sick, that hardness became sharp. Evan didn't come often, but when he did, he asked questions that made my skin prickle. Not, "How's Dad holding up?" but "Where are the important documents?" Not, "Is he comfortable?" but "Does he still handle his finances?" One day in the hospital hallway, while Richard dozed, Evan pulled me aside and spoke in a low voice. "Do you know where Dad keeps the will?" he asked. "Or the safe deposit box? Anything like that?" I stared at him. "Your father is alive," I said. "He's right there." Evan shrugged like I was naive. "I'm just trying to prepare." At the time, I told myself he was grieving in his own way, that people do strange things when they're scared. But now looking back, I can admit what my gut told me that day. He wasn't preparing for grief. He was preparing for possession. After that appraisal, my friend Dina came over. Dina is 60, blunt, loyal, and the kind of woman who doesn't let people walk over her. She sat at my kitchen table, listened, and then asked one simple question. "Who could have touched that box?" she said, "besides you and Richard?" The answer sat between us like a stone. Evan. Dina's eyes narrowed. Did he ever ask for one? A keepsake? And I remembered. I remembered Evan visiting once when Richard was weaker than usual, his voice thin, his eyes closed most of the time. Evan had leaned over and said, "Dad, could I take one of the watches? Just to feel close to you." Richard had nodded faintly. I'd actually felt touched by it in the moment. It had felt like something human. Now it felt like a door opening. That night I went through the house. I wasn't looking for treasure. I was looking for proof. I dug through drawers, filing cabinets, old notebooks. Richard was a note-taker. He wrote down everything from oil changes to birthdays, but I couldn't find anything about the watches. No serial numbers, no receipts, nothing. I searched until my knees ached and my eyes burned. Eventually, I ended up sitting on the floor in Richard's small office, surrounded by papers that meant nothing, feeling defeated, and then my eyes landed on the watch box on the shelf. Something tugged at my memory. Richard once told me, almost as an aside, "I like that box. It's got a double bottom." A double bottom. My heart started pounding. I pulled the box down and flipped it over. I ran my fingers along the underside, feeling for a seam. At first, there was nothing, just smooth wood. Then I found the faintest ridge, almost invisible. I pressed gently. The bottom slid open, like a hidden drawer. Inside was no money, no jewelry, just a thin envelope. My hands shook so badly I tore the edge when I opened it. The paper inside was folded neatly, but the handwriting on it, Richard's handwriting, looked slightly shaky, like he'd written it on a hard day. "Marilyn," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm not there to hold your hand." I had to stop. I pressed the paper to my chest and breathed because grief came roaring up like a wave. Then I forced myself to keep reading. "I don't want you fighting anyone," Richard wrote. "But I also don't want you getting stepped on. There are things I've suspected for a long time." About Evan. My stomach clenched. I took photos and recorded serial markings of the pieces that matter. I placed some of the authentic items in the safe deposit box. If someone tries to replace or remove things, you'll have a way to prove it. And if Evan tries to shame you in front of family after I'm gone, go see Andrea Cole. Tell her the phrase, "Granddad's watch." I was crying quietly now, tears dripping onto the paper. Not only because Richard was gone, but because he'd had to plan for betrayal from his own son. Because he'd seen this coming and carried it alone. In the envelope behind the letter was a list. Model descriptions, serial markings, tiny notes about scratches and dents the way Richard would, dates, even references to photos he'd taken. I read it twice, then a third time. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something besides helplessness. I felt a footing. That evening, Dina texted me. Evan had posted online. I opened Facebook with dread, and there it was. Evan's long, polished post, written like a wounded son standing over his father's grave. "Today we buried my father," he wrote. "I can hardly breathe from the pain. But I'm even more devastated to realize some of his most treasured belongings are missing. I don't want to accuse anyone. I just want Dad's things returned so he can rest." He didn't name me. He didn't have to. The comments underneath made my skin crawl. Poor Evan. Some women. Money always shows who people really are. I stared at those words until my eyes blurred. I wanted to respond. I wanted to scream that I had held Richard while he was dying, that I had emptied bedpans and argued with insurance companies and kissed his forehead when he couldn't sleep. But Richard's letter echoed in my head. Don't fight with emotion. Fight with truth. The next morning, I drove to Andrea Cole's law office. It was in an older brick building downtown, quiet and professional. The receptionist asked my name, and I said, I need to see Andrea, and I have a phrase, Granddad's watch. The woman's face changed. She didn't ask questions. She simply picked up the phone. A few minutes later, Andrea appeared. Mid-40s, hair pulled back, eyes sharp but not unkind. She took one look at my face and said softly, Mrs. Hart, I've been expecting you. I handed her Richard's letter. She read it without speaking, then opened a drawer and pulled out a folder already prepared. Richard started planning 2 years ago, she said. He didn't want you pushed out of his life after he was gone. I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Why would he think? Andrea's voice stayed steady. Because he noticed Evan behaving strangely around certain pieces. Richard wasn't 100% sure at first, but he began documenting anyway. He took photos, recorded serial numbers, and moved the most important originals into a safe deposit box. He also added a codicil to his estate plan. A codicil, I repeated, wiping my cheeks. My throat was raw. Andrea nodded. A legal addition? A safeguard. It's enforceable. She explained that if Evan wanted to escalate, he could attempt to force an inventory through probate court. He could try to paint me as an unfit spouse, a greedy one, an outsider. And the worst part was that public opinion would always lean toward the grieving child if the widow stayed quiet. So we don't stay quiet, Andrea said, but we also don't do this on Facebook. We do it properly. We create a controlled setting with cameras, independent experts, and documentation. We invite Evan to show his hand. My palms were damp. How? Andrea drafted a response to Evan's attorney the same day. It refused to hand over the collection for him to hold, but offered a formal appraisal meeting at her office, witnessed, recorded, documented. She even invited Evan to bring any pieces he claimed were the originals, along with any proof. The meeting was scheduled for Friday. Between then and Friday, Evan didn't stop. He didn't just push for the watches. He pushed for the narrative. People I'd known for years started acting different. A woman from church who used to hug me suddenly offered a stiff smile. A neighbor who once helped Richard fix a fence avoided eye contact. Grief already makes you feel invisible. Being suspected makes you feel stained. At night, I'd lie awake and stare at the ceiling, hearing Evan's voice in my head. Taking care of someone doesn't mean you get to own what belongs to them. I started to question myself in a way that felt humiliating. Had I earned any place in Richard's story? Did people really believe I was nothing but a woman who married in and waited to grab what she could? Dina came by again and found me standing in front of the watch box, staring, frozen. Mare, she said gently, you're not crazy, you're grieving, and he's counting on you being too tired to fight. I nodded, but my chest still felt tight. Andrea called me the day before Friday and said, one more thing. I want you to open the safe deposit box before the meeting. Bring whatever is inside that matches Richard's documentation. We'll keep the originals under your control. On Friday morning, I went to the bank. Banks feel different when you're not opening an account, but opening a piece of someone's life. Everything is quiet and cold and official. A clerk led me down into the secure area and placed a metal box in front of me. I signed my name with a hand that trembled. When I opened it, I had to bite my lip to keep from making a sound. There they were, the watches I remembered. The weight, the detail, the familiar small scratches. And nestled in a soft pouch was the anniversary ring Richard had given me years ago after a particularly hard season, when we'd almost lost the house and still somehow found a way to laugh. My eyes filled instantly. It wasn't greed that made me cry. It was the tenderness of Richard's planning. The way he'd protected me even when he couldn't protect himself from illness. The way he'd said, in ink and in law, that I belonged. I took what I needed for the meeting and locked the rest back up, as if I were placing Richard's heart back into a safe place. At 10 o'clock, I walked into Andrea's office carrying a small case. Mr. Patel was there too, dressed neatly, holding his appraisal tools. A notary sat at the table with paperwork ready. A camera was positioned in the corner, obvious and intentional. At 10:15, Evan arrived. He looked composed, too composed. Suit jacket, clean hair, the expression of a man who believes he's about to win simply because he's loudest. He stepped in and glanced at me with the faintest smirk. "You're here," he said, as if I was the one being unreasonable. I didn't answer. I kept my hands folded in my lap, the way you do when you're trying not to shake. Andrea stood. "We'll begin," she said. "Everything will be recorded. We'll proceed item by item." "Mr. Patel is our independent expert." Evan shrugged. "Fine. I just want my father's property back." He said it like he was talking about a lost suitcase. We placed the watch box from the house on the table. Evan immediately pointed to the empty slots, repeating his accusation. "See? Missing." Mr. Patel examined what remained. He confirmed calmly that at least one piece inside had been tampered with. Movement swapped, casing inconsistent, signs of repeated opening. Evan's eyes lit up with something almost eager. "Exactly," he said. "She swapped them." I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to protest. I wanted to beg someone, anyone, to remember the truth of the months I spent at Richard's bedside. But Andrea's calm voice held the room steady. "Evan," she said, "you've made a claim. So we'll ask a simple question. Do you have any proof? Photos, receipts, serial numbers? Anything that supports your claim that Marilyn removed originals and replaced them with counterfeits?" For the first time, Evan hesitated. Just a fraction. Then he reached into his bag and produced a watch. He placed it on the table like a trump card. "This," he said, "this is one of the real ones. Dad gave it to me. I've had it for years." Mr. Patel picked it up. He turned it under the light, opened the back, stared through the loop. Then he set it down gently and said, "The casing is correct style, but the movement inside is not appropriate for the model. It's been replaced." Evan blinked. "What?" Mr. Patel pointed to a specific component. "This adjustment lever is from a cheaper line. The authentic version wouldn't have this. Someone changed it." Evan's face tightened. "That's impossible." Andrea's voice stayed even. "If it's impossible, Evan, then something else is true. And the meeting we're in right now is exactly why we're here, to determine what's true." She turned to me. "Marilyn, would you like to provide Richard's documentation?" My hands were shaking now, but I lifted the folder and placed it on the table. Andrea opened it to a page that included the very model Evan claimed was real. There was a photo, Richard's photo, from 2 years ago, clear enough to see a small scratch near the lower edge of the casing. Next to it was Richard's handwritten note of the serial marking. Mr. Patel flipped Evan's watch, checked the engraving. The serial did not match. The scratch pattern was different too. Silence dropped over the room like a blanket. Evan's mouth opened and closed once. "She could have forged that," he said quickly. "Anyone could." Andrea didn't argue. She simply produced an email printout. "Richard sent these photos to me while he was alive," she said. "They're time-stamped. They're stored in our system. They're not something Marilyn created after the fact." Evan's eyes darted around the room. The man who'd come with him, his advisor, I realized, shifted in his seat, suddenly less confident. Andrea leaned forward slightly. "Evan, what we're seeing here suggests not that Marilyn stole from your father, but that someone tampered with the collection. Someone opened cases. Someone swapped movements. Someone replaced originals with fakes." Evan's jaw tightened. "I didn't swap anything," he snapped. Andrea nodded. "Good. Then you won't object to us obtaining footage from the pawn shop where you've been seen attempting to appraise or sell similar pieces." Evan stood abruptly. "I have never..." And then in the panic of the moment, he said the one sentence that changed everything. It came out too fast, too emotional, too real. "I only swapped a few." The room went dead. I could hear the hum of the office ventilation. I could hear my own breathing. Mr. Patel's hand froze above the table. The notary's pen stopped moving. Evan's face drained, and for a split second he looked like a child who'd just realized he'd spoken out loud. Andrea's eyes didn't widen. She didn't need to. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You said swapped, Evan," she said. "That's an admission that you altered items in your father's collection." Evan's throat worked. I meant I was protecting them. She didn't deserve them." And there it was. Not grief. Not love. Ownership. He turned toward me and his eyes were red, but not with sadness, with rage. "She's not my mother," he said. "She doesn't belong to this family. She's an outsider." My heart clenched. Not because his words hurt me personally, I'd heard that tone in him for years, but because I suddenly understood how far he'd gone to make that belief into reality. Andrea lifted a hand slightly, controlling the room with quiet authority. "Evan," she said, "your feelings are not the issue today. Your actions are, and your father anticipated this." She opened a document and read aloud a short section, Richard's codicil. The words were plain, legal, and devastating. If any party harassed, defamed, or attempted to shame Marilyn Hart after Richard's death in an effort to control or seize estate property, that party's inheritance would be forfeited and diverted to a local cancer support fund, a cause Richard had supported quietly for years. Evan's lips parted. "No," he whispered. "He wouldn't." "He did," Andrea said, "and it is valid." Evan's shoulders lifted and fell in a sharp breath. He looked at me like I'd personally taken something from him, like I'd orchestrated his father's law office from beyond the grave. "You made him do that," he spat. I felt a sharp sting behind my eyes, but my voice came out low and steady, surprising even me. "No," I said. "Your father did that because he knew you. He did that because he loved you, and he loved me, and he didn't want either of us turning his death into a war." Evan let out a short, bitter laugh. "A war? You think you get to lecture me? Do you know what it was like growing up without him? He chose you." My chest tightened, because there was pain there, real pain. But pain doesn't give you the right to destroy someone else. Andrea spoke before I could, firm now. "Evan, you can be hurt and still be responsible. You can be angry and still obey the law. What you cannot do is tamper with property, replace items, publicly accuse someone of theft without proof, and then claim it was protection." Mr. Patel added calmly that the physical evidence, fresh adhesive, repeated tool marks, movement mismatches, indicated consistent tampering. The notary documented everything. Andrea informed Evan that if the harassment and defamation continued, the firm would proceed with formal action and cooperate with any criminal investigation. Evan's advisor stood and touched his arm. "Evan," he murmured, "we need to leave." Evan looked around the room as if searching for sympathy, for someone to validate the story he'd built. But nobody did. He stormed out without another word, the door closing behind him with a hollow sound that made me flinch. When the room emptied, I sat very still. My whole body felt like it had been carrying a weight for months and had only just put it down. I stared at the watch on the table, at the photographs, at Richard's handwriting, and a deep, aching grief washed over me, not only because of what Evan had tried to do, but because Richard had known he might. Richard had spent his final years loving his son from a distance, hoping for softness that never came, and still preparing to protect me from the sharp edges. In the weeks that followed, the narrative shifted, but not as loudly as it had spread. That's something people don't tell you. Lies move like wildfire, and the truth moves like a tired person climbing stairs. Andrea obtained the footage needed from a pawn shop after the appropriate legal steps. Evan's online post disappeared. A few people quietly deleted their comments. Some neighbors avoided me out of embarrassment. One woman from church showed up at my door holding a casserole and said, "I'm sorry," with tears in her eyes. I accepted the apology because I didn't have the energy to carry bitterness. But I didn't forget how quickly people were willing to believe the worst. The hospital bills got paid slowly. Not because I sold Richard's life away, but because Richard had left me resources in a way that couldn't be easily stolen from my hands. Andrea helped me settle the estate properly with documentation and care. Dina showed up without being asked because that's what real family does. And the watches, the real ones, became something else. I kept one item for myself, the anniversary ring from the safe deposit box. I didn't keep it to prove anything. I kept it because it was my marriage in metal and stone, a reminder that someone had loved me enough to think of me even when he was too weak to speak. As for the collection, I followed Richard's wishes. Some pieces went to the Cancer Support Fund, sold transparently through proper channels so the money could help people drowning under medical costs the way Richard and I had been. A few pieces went to specific recipients Richard named: old friends, a cousin who'd helped him when he was younger, a small community organization he believed in. I didn't want Richard's memory to become a prize people fought over. I wanted it to become a kind of warmth, something that kept someone else going the way Richard's steady hands had kept me going. One night, long after the legal papers were signed and the worst of the noise had faded, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in that particular way it becomes when you've lost someone who filled the rooms with small sounds: footsteps, humming, a sigh as he sat down. I placed the ring on the table in front of me and stared at it under the soft light. I imagined Richard there, cleaning one of his watches the way he used to, shoulders slightly hunched, a look of focus on his face that was almost tender. I whispered into the quiet like he could hear me. I didn't do it alone, I told him. Like you asked, I didn't stay quiet. I stood up. Slow, but I stood up. Outside, the wind moved through bare branches, and for the first time in a long time, the silence in my home didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. Space to breathe. Space to heal. And space to remember Richard the way he deserved to be remembered, not as a pile of things his son could claim, but as a man who loved deeply, planned wisely, and left behind something stronger than any watch. He left behind the truth. And in the end, the truth found its way home.